Hello, I'm Stephen Matchett from Campus Morning Mail, and this is Expert Opinion, where we ask people who know what is going on in education and training, what's going on. Expert Opinion is brought to you by Twig Marketing, Australia's original higher ed marketing consultancy. Got a brand issue or a message that isn't getting out there? Talk to Tim Winkler, tim@twigmarketing, that's one word, .com. And thanks to producer Amanda Johnson from Twig, who makes Expert Opinion happen. Last week's Jobs and Skills Summit was a huge hawkie of consensus, exceeding the 1983 original for discussions on big policy questions, notably in Voc Ed and Higher Ed, where HE lobbies acknowledged post-secondary could be one system. It was probably what the government wanted, if they mentioned it as well. So what happened and what does it mean? I'm joined by a woman well qualified to make sense of the summit. Claire Field is a former regulator who now analyses training for clients, produces an immensely informed newsletter, and also writes for CMM. Thanks for sparing the time, Claire. I know how busy you are. Can I start, Claire, by asking what was important for post-school education and training at the summit?
Oh, what a great question, Stephen, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. Obviously, VET, particularly TAFE. It was a conversation which had a number of representatives from universities participating in the discussion, but by and large, the discussion wasn't about universities. Their research and expertise was important, but this was a conversation about, some would say, the long forgotten child of our education system, and that is the VET sector, and particularly the government's focus on TAFE. So there were concerns expressed by business leaders, by Mary Ferrone, the chair of TAFE Directors Australia, unions and others, about the need for additional funding. The Prime Minister started the summit with an announcement of additional funding for the next year, while skills ministers work together on a new version of the National Skills Agreement.
A lot of talk about apprenticeships as opposed to other forms and directions of learning.
There was two areas of focus, I think, with apprenticeships. And I should just disclose here that one of the positions I hold is as a director, non-executive director of an apprenticeship services provider, MEGT. And the two areas of discussion were, firstly, how do we prevent the high levels of dropout? Non-completion is an issue, a surprising issue in the apprenticeship sector, when you think that this is often young people into jobs with a training component. And that was a particular area of concern. And the other area of focus when it came to apprenticeships was really, how do we move them into digital cadetships, apprenticeships, traineeships? Let's get more people, particularly, and again, this reflected the focus of the summit, people from non-traditional backgrounds working in the tech sector, and that cadetships or traineeships were an ideal way to do that.
What's this going to mean for the full service six, the universities that also have large training components?
Oh, I think it's good news for the dual sectors, that there's additional funding will come to their TAFE divisions, assuming that it's enough. And I don't mean to be less than enthusiastic about the funding that's on offer. But again, Mary Ferrone, in her address to the summit, was very clear that when we advertise free TAFE, there are often students who come with additional significant extra support needs. So there's been some talk that the Commonwealth will fund additional wraparound support, and that's going to be important if we see more students come into the sector needing that support. What's also going to be important is finding extra teachers to be teaching, whether they're in the dual sector universities or a standalone TAFE. And a further complication, and we saw this again in Victoria with a separate announcement on nursing places, and the Victorian government offering to pay the HECS fees for nursing students. great, lovely, welcomed. How do we manage the mandatory work placements?
Yeah.
And that's going to be an issue with these free TAFE places. If they're going to be in aged care and childcare and related occupations, getting people into those mandatory work placements is going to require significant effort.
Yeah. When the government talks training, it often appears that TAFE is a synonym for training. There doesn't seem to be a lot in this for the private providers.
There's not. And that, I mean, if we're really, candid, that was pretty clear in Labor's pre-election announcements. They didn't announce, it struck me at the time, as we went into the election, you'll recall that the coalition had just handed down their budget in March, and they were budgeting 3.7 billion extra Commonwealth funding and indicating it would pay for about an extra 800,000 places over 5 years. Labor, by contrast, had a much more modest offer of additional places. It was 40,000 extra places and 425,000, this is all in TAFE, which would be converted from existing government funded places. Some might have been in TAFE, some in community providers, some in private providers, and they would instead be offered with no student fees in TAFE. So TAFE has been at the heart of Labor's policy agenda as it went to the election and subsequently. It's made a commitment that 70% of government funding will go to the TAFE sector while it is in.
And that's traditionally been 60%?
No, it hasn't had a figure before. I mean, it started off years ago, obviously, at nearly 100%. Without getting too historical, the introduction of user choice about 25, 30 years ago, allowing employers to choose who would train their workers, was the start of significant reform and choice, and that then flowed through to students outside of the apprenticeship system. We've currently got about 65% of all government funding going to the TAFE sector. So some shift is likely, but the difference between what the Commonwealth funds and what the state funds is a real complicating factor in that. And I can't see that the new Commonwealth government is going to mandate how the states spend, what share goes to TAFE and what doesn't. And just very briefly, many of your viewers and readers might think that Labor equals TAFE and coalition governments equal funding priority for the private sector. It's a point that Monash Emeritus Professor Gerald Burke has made recently, and I think bears restating. In the vet sector, that is not necessarily true. The state with the highest proportion of funding going to private providers is Queensland, where you've had a majority Labor government for many, many, many years. And in fact, the state with currently the highest proportion of funding going to TAFE is New South Wales, where you've got a Liberal government coalition and concerns about loss of teacher places in TAFE. So it's tricky. But to go back to your point, there is nothing in the announcement for private providers additionally. So those who are currently offering government funded places will largely be untouched, except in a couple of states. And I won't get too technical on that, but there's some mandatory requirements in New South Wales and WA particularly about the fees that you have to charge. So if you're a private provider in one of those states and TAFE's got more fee-free places, then overwhelmingly you're going to lose some students as they choose a fee-free place. In the other states, providers have more flexibility and can discount. So we won't necessarily see a shift there. But to sum up, no additional new funding outside of the TAFE sector in 2023.
The previous government tried from memory, the previous government tried to work out a national price for teaching per unit, as it were, which the states basically knocked back. What's the current government going to do?
We don't know yet. I think it's pretty clear. TAFE directors have made their view clear, and unsurprisingly, given TAFE institutes are state-owned entities, their view aligns with their state governments, which is that I think, to be fair to the former government, it wasn't one single price. It was that, hairdressing might be this and construction might be that, and that there would be loadings or weightings for regional or particular high needs students, etc. And we did see, interestingly, some states, particularly Victoria, having a look at how their funding for some courses was quite out of step with other states. So in part, the work that the last government did has allowed state governments a bit more readily to contrast where their funding is quite different from the average or from others. The current government hasn't said a lot about it. I don't envisage that they're going to try to force it through with the states and territories. On the other hand, I'd be surprised if they're not asking some questions about, there are some real anomalies, and what that means when you're thinking about access and equity and disadvantage. What that means is that potentially some students miss out, or it is harder for them because there is less government funding available. So I expect it to be in the mix, but I don't know that they're going to be pushing it nearly as hard as the former government.
TAFE systems in the big states are huge, and they get accused, undoubtedly, unfairly, of being sclerotic. Are they going to be able to pick up the pace sufficiently?
I think it's an unfair criticism, in part because these changes have been imposed upon them, and they are grappling with how to make these organisational changes. At the same time, don't forget that the Commonwealth and states and territories in VET, far more than in higher education, are making an incredible number of ongoing policy, funding and regulatory reform. So the NCVR has a fabulous list, if you're a nerd, about policy, and you can see all of the changes that have been made. And when you add them up, over the last 20 plus years, on average, it's one major reform that the NCVR says will likely influence funding or student places about every fortnight, every year for 20 plus years. So while you're trying to do major organisational change in an institution and the world around you continues to change, that's hard. But it doesn't excuse what's going to be required. And what's going to be required is adapting to the government's priorities, which are full qualifications, fee-free places. So you don't be focused on recruiting the teachers, finding the work placements, expanding your offerings. And at the same time, and what I worry about for the TAFE sector is the nimbleness of employers changing what of work, more micro-credentials, the upskilling piece. If your focus is on the delivery of full qualifications and the industry advice going into the sector at a national or a state level isn't sufficient, that you keep your course content and your teachers up to date with the cutting edge of change in your industry. It's going to be particularly challenging in some, like digital. Does that mean we see a further criticism of sclerosis because of the requirements that governments have on the TAFE sector? And so there are some reforms coming which are designed to make full qualifications better and introduce micro-credentials. I think they're going to be really critical that we get those right.
And is that an opportunity? I mean, you write about this a great deal, about for private providers, for corporates, for large corporates, to start expanding into the training space.
Absolutely. I think there's two opportunities. So if you're a registered RTO, an independent or a private provider, there is legislation in the Parliament at the moment that the new government intends to legislate, a promise actually made by the last government. And that's a particular tax deduction for training activity. Universities will be eligible for it too. More broadly though, we are seeing private vet providers increasingly moving into non-accredited training. And to go to your point, we are seeing a huge number of global, Australian, large and small, providers of training, corporate focused, not at all interested in the AQF and recognition. This is about a dynamic upskilling of the workplace. And yes, we will, I think, inevitably see more of that.
Which is a threat to universities as much as it is to trainers.
I think the immediate threat is mostly to the vet sector, because there's a large number of students currently who enrol in vet just for a single unit or subject one or two. In higher education, you can see certainly the ATN universities, and I wrote about it the other day, the University of Melbourne as one of the group of 8 and others, who are starting to think through their postgraduate offerings, right? This isn't a threat necessarily to your undergraduate offerings, and I do sort of say, we're never going to be teaching doctors in a 6-month online course. So, but there are some areas around, again, tech, around marketing, around business leadership, etc., where there is already an offering, and some of these global giants are truly global, $100 million a year in education from teaching and learning, highly sophisticated and backed by artificial intelligence to continually improve their learning offerings. And I think many, not just in Australia, but many traditional institutions have quite a way to go to step up to that level of sophistication.
In the upskilling space, as opposed to the foundation basics, in the upskilling space, it seems as if there will be a particular challenge for probably unaccredited, but just new skills. You use medicine as an example, doctors as an example. During the pandemic, there were a massive MOOCs. I mean, University of Queensland did a couple, I remember, specifically dealing for medical practitioners. Multiply that across the economy, it's an enormous market.
It certainly is. And yes, you're absolutely right. It's so when I was saying 6 months, you won't do a 6-month course to become a doctor, no. But once you are a doctor or an architect or an HR director or choose your occupation, learning those as the world of work changes, as we go through, some say industry 4.0, others say industry 5, someone even told me a year or two ago, industry 6. The pace of change and what it means for how people work and the services that they offer means that reskilling and upskilling piece is significant, and it's not going to go away.
So what does that mean? I mean, I know I'm talking in terms of accreditation, but what does that mean for the registered training organisation accredited model?
I think it puts pressure on it. It really goes to what can a registered training organisation teach? And what we've seen in the IT sector in the last few years is that what is captured and recorded in the training package, which TAFEs and other providers have to design their qualifications around, is insufficiently flexible and kept updated quickly enough, lack of agility. And so a number of private providers have moved into a majority offering of non-accredited industry certified courses. So there is a big piece for the new industry clusters who will have responsibility for these training packages to make sure that they are getting up-to-date advice from employers. But related to that, we had a media release issued by Minister O'Connor over the weekend that Labor will work with, the government will work with the states and territories and unions and business on simplifying vet qualifications. And that's a good thing. No one, especially not me, would argue that the current approach is right. We pack too much in, but there's an important reason, again, putting my ex-regulator hat on. We have done that because the system did not have confidence in quality. And so people kept saying, oh, write it in the training package. That will make sure people are taught it. So we have to simplify what we teach, but we can only do that if we properly educate, professionally upskill our teachers, and if we have confidence in the regulation and the quality of the system. And there's some statistics out, some analysis by the Productivity Commission, which suggests that as ASQA has rolled out their new self-assurance model, they have found far less serious non-compliance. Now, that should be a cause for celebration if it's true. So we can tweak something to try and make the system more responsive to employers and make registered training organisations better able to keep up. But if we don't have those other foundations, the teachers who don't require all the microscopic detail in the training package, and a quality system, which means if you take out the detail, some training providers won't move to cheat, right? And just do cheap and nasty courses. So you're going to have to get all of those things in alignment for this to work.
Which is an enormous task. I mean, once upon a time, I'm sure plumbing didn't change from one generation to the next. Does now.
Sure does.
And
it's where we tackle these reforms too often in a fragmented way. We see a problem and there's huge goodwill right around the system, and we look to tackle it. And unfortunately, what we don't think about are all the other associated reforms. So very briefly, I was in Germany a couple of years pre-pandemic, meeting with a range of people there, looking at how their vet system is changing and responding to advanced manufacturing and industry 4.0. Their equivalent of our unit of competency. So our average runs to 4 or 5 pages for each unit, all the details that need to be taught. Theirs typically runs to 1.5 pages. Why? Because they have stability in how they make changes to them. They don't keep changing things every 4 or 5 years, new groups involved. So they've got stability in terms of employers, unions and educators working together on agreeing what needs to be taught and making changes. They've got highly educated teachers who can take 1.5 pages and design a subject around that. And they've got really good quality assurance around the assessment to make sure that there isn't any cheap and nasty training activity going on. So this time around, we have to pull the whole piece together.
And is their training system a federal base?
It certainly is.
So, what makes that work, given state governments here often have quite distinct views?
I think you could say the same about Canada, right, which is also a federal system. Yeah. There is no country in the world that I am aware of that makes the number of policy changes to such an important sector as frequently as we do. And we are mentally prepared here for, oh, it's a change of government at the state or the Commonwealth level. That means I have to change my business model. It's inevitable. We see it as inevitable that it will change. I'm not an expert on Germany or Canada, but what I would say is there is much greater bipartisanship about the importance of technical training, whatever label you want to give to it. And therefore it is seen much less as, and I don't mean to be unkind to Australian politicians, but much less as a political plaything, and much more about a consensus of the way a system must work, with some improvements and modifications, but they are worked through. And again, it kind of goes back to where you started the conversation, that notion of trying to have conversations with everybody that characterises the intent of the summit, to bring people together and try and agree longer lasting reforms. Last point on that, New Zealand is not a federated system, obviously, but nonetheless, it's had multiple changes of governments, and it has, coalition governments. It is now the usual in New Zealand. So lots of contested ideas. Its industry engagement into its vet system, those policy settings, had been stable for over 20 years.
So I know you're busy, so I won't hold you up, but where does this all put Jobs and Skills Australia? I mean, the legislation before the Parliament now won't, I don't think, be the final ones. I think this is the enabling stuff. But where do you think its role should be?
Well, I have, because I'm a nerd, I have read many of the submissions into the legislation. And I say that not to brag about nerdiness, but because there are some great submissions. Most of them have focused on the activities that it should have. Only a few have focused on its governance, and yet I think that's going to be really critical. Dr. Craig Fowler, former head of the NCBR, amongst other roles, has done a really good piece arguing that Jobs and Skills Australia will be a better institution. Looking back in history, we've had this before, various iterations of the model. If it has a federal a governance model that recognises we're in a federation, as in the states and territories are a huge part of the vet system. If they are not bought into some kind of governance role, if they're only consulted by Jobs and Skills Australia, then it will be a variation of the National Skills Commission. Skills forecasting, more so than the National Skills Commission, giving advice into immigration and home affairs, helping to inform our visa and immigration settings, and helping, offer up ideas on how many plumbers we'll need in 5 or 10 years' time. And that's important. I don't think that's not important. But what we've seen, if we look historically, we've had a number of those institutions who've done that. And again, with a change of government, there isn't buy-in from the states and territories. Their advice isn't necessarily acted on. You can forecast that you need 10,000 extra plumbers. Well, if state X says, yeah, my share of that would be 2,000 extra plumbers, but I think we need more green energy engineers, so I'm going to put more money into that. There's no mechanism to try and have that debate and discussion about where the funding goes after the Jobs and Skills Australia have done their forecasting. So thinking through the governance is going to be critical, and I don't have a sense yet on whether the new government really wants states and territories around the table with Jobs and Skills Australia decisions. That's not critical.
Well, yeah, once you've got one, you've got to have the rest. And all of a sudden.
Yes, you certainly do.
Any advice to whoever runs it?
Oh, enjoy it and care about the system. Right. I mean, I do. It's a hugely important system. It is terrific to see it get national attention. It's hard, it's complex, there's a huge range of stakeholders, but it's absolutely vital. And taking on that leadership role will be a huge opportunity to give back to the sector, to whomever that they appoint to it.
Claire Field, thank you so much for sparing the time. You want nerdiness? I just found that fascinating. I think it's just possibly the most complex policy issue the Commonwealth faces. It's just great.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Always happy to talk about the vet sector. No problem.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, and thanks to the audience. This is Expert Opinion, and we're out.